I come to the Senate floor to advise my colleagues about a new rule that the Department of Homeland Security published in the Federal Register this very day to finally bring some needed reform to the EB-5 green card program. As I mentioned in my remarks on this topic last week, this rule was first proposed in January 2017. Those of us who want to reform the EB-5 program have been waiting 2.5 years for this rule to become final. And we've been waiting much, much longer than that for some meaningful reforms to this fraudulent-laden program that we tried to get enacted into law in previous Congresses and couldn't get done because of being up against these very powerful moneyed interests. I think the President and his team deserves a lot of credit for pushing these reforms across the finish line and getting a big win for rural America. As I have said on numerous occasions, Congress intended for the EB-5 program to help spur investment in rural and high unemployment areas when this program was established in 1990. Unfortunately, over the last 30 years, big moneyed interests have been able to gerrymander EB-5 targeted employment areas in a way that redirected investment away from our rural and economically deprived communities and towards major development projects in Manhattan and other big cities. Therefore, instead of providing much needed investment for rural America as originally intended, EB-5 has become a source of cheap foreign capital for development projects in already prosperous areas of America. For the first time, this rule will bring very needed change so that condition cannot continue. Under the rule, states will no longer be allowed to game and gerrymander targeted employment areas. Instead, the Department of Homeland Security will make targeted employment area designations directly based on revised requirements that will help to ensure rural and high unemployment areas get more of the investment that they've been deprived of for far too long under this program as it's been misdirected. Again, this is a major win for rural America and high unemployment areas. And I want to sincerely thank President Trump and the people that worked in the administration on this rule for making this happen and looking out for the interests of my constituents in Iowa and other rural states and for areas of high unemployment. This rule also addresses the minimum investment threshold amounts that are required for the EB-5 projects around the country. This is the very first time the investment threshold has been adjusted since the program was created in 1990, and think of the inflation since that time. For projects that are outside of the targeted employment areas, the threshold will be raised from $1 million to $1.8 million. For projects in targeted employment areas, the threshold will be raised from $500,000 to $900,000. The minimum investment amount will be automatically adjusted for inflation every 5 years. It's ridiculous that our country's major green card program for investors has been operating with investment amounts that haven't been adjusted a single time in 30 years. That makes no sense. And I'm glad the President and his team have taken necessary action to restore a little common sense to the EB-5 program. Now, there's more work that needs to be done on the EB-5 program, and we'll have to do that by legislation, but the President and his administration deserve a lot of credit for finally implementing those first reforms that I and several other colleagues have championed for years. I, more than the most, understand the power and influence of big-moneyed EB-5 interests have historically had in Washington, and how they have used that power and that influence to consistently thwart any attempt to reform this program in such an obvious way that it's needed. Their unrelenting efforts to stymie EB-5 reform over the years absolutely epitomizes the swamp culture that so many voters rejected in the last presidential election. And getting rid of that swamp culture is exactly what the president campaigned on. And this is a perfect example of his carrying out a campaign promise. They're also representative of a culture in Washington that too often disregards the interests of the little guy in rural Iowa in favor of the interests of the rich and the powerful. So again, I applaud the President and his team for standing up to these rich and powerful interests. I'm happy to say that with the publication of this rule, the little guys in rural America finally got a win in the EB-5 program. I now look forward to working with the President and my colleagues to build off this win and to bring further reforms to the EB-5 program. Thank you, President Trump.